The gavel struck once, and silence flooded the courtroom. My mother's voice carried like a knife through the air. "She can barely hold a job." The words weren't whispered in anger across a dinner table. They weren't muttered during some family squabble behind closed doors. No, she stood under oath, looking straight at the Chief Justice, and gutted me in front of the entire panel. Every reporter's pen froze. I felt the weight of dozens of eyes, the brass insignia on my uniform suddenly heavier than the Kevlar vest I'd worn in combat. My mother, blood of my blood, had turned executioner. "My name is Major Nadine Whitaker. I am 38 years old and I serve as an officer in the United States Army. I've survived ambushes, patrols gone wrong, nights where mortars rained like fire. But nothing prepared me for the betrayal of my own mother when she raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and painted me as a fraud in front of the law." Her gray eyes never wavered. She had dressed as though for church, neat blazer, pearl earrings, lips set in a prim smile. I could almost smell the faint rosewater perfume she'd worn since childhood mornings when she used to braid my hair. Only this time, there was no warmth, no tenderness. Behind her, my brother Stephen sat stiff, arms folded, jaw tight. He'd always been her shadow, repeating her judgments like scripture. My younger sister Lila wasn't there. She hadn't answered my calls in weeks. But in that moment, even her absence cut like betrayal. Only my Aunt Monica, loyal to a fault, sat in the back row, her face stricken with disbelief. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. Ceiling fans hummed above, though the heat of stairs made the air stifling. My palms itched against the fabric of my service uniform. Every medal and ribbon pinned to my chest suddenly felt like they'd been melted into lead. "Major Whitaker," the Chief Justice said slowly, "you've heard your mother's testimony. Do you wish to respond?" But before I could open my mouth, the bench rustled. The justice leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the papers in his hand. He stood, the entire room tensed, his robes whispered as he rose, and when he spoke, his voice boomed. "This record shows Major Nadine Whitaker has served with distinction for 8 consecutive years as a military judge advocate. Commendations, deployments, successful prosecutions. Her record is immaculate." Gasps rippled through the benches. My mother's face drained of color as though someone had poured bleach through her veins. For a split second, my mind wandered back to childhood. Me at 12, clutching an award certificate from school, running into our kitchen, desperate to show her. She hadn't even looked up from her crossword puzzle. "That's nice, Nadine," she had said. "But don't get too proud. Pride ruins people." That memory burned brighter than ever as I looked at her now. This woman who had chosen jealousy over love, courtroom lies over family loyalty. The justice's gavel tapped again. "We'll recess for 1 hour." Chairs scraped, voices rose, and reporters surged toward the doors. I stood frozen, torn between rage and heartbreak, as my mother's eyes darted like a cornered animal. Stephen grabbed her arm, whispering furiously. Aunt Monica's gaze found mine across the chaos, her lips forming the silent words, "I believe you." I nodded back, but the knot in my stomach tightened. The recess wasn't just a pause, it was the calm before something far worse. Because if my own mother had chosen to destroy me in public, I needed to know why, and what game she was playing behind closed doors. And I swore to myself, I'd uncover it, no matter the cost. The hour of recess felt like a battlefield lull, the kind where silence weighs heavier than the gunfire that came before. I slipped into a side corridor, away from the cameras and whispers. My boots clicked against the marble floor, each sound sharp and accusing. My uniform clung to me in the heat, my tie suddenly strangling. I loosened it, but the knot in my chest only grew tighter. I needed answers. Stephen cornered me before I reached the water fountain. His face was pale, but his eyes gleamed with the same arrogance he'd worn since childhood. "You should have quit when you had the chance, Nadine," he hissed. "Mom's only telling the truth. You can't keep pretending you're better than us." I stared at him, jaw clenched. Better? I bled for this country, Stephen. I fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. And you think this is about pride? His smirk faltered, but he pressed on. It's about control. Mom's finally showing the world what you are. A fraud dressed in medals. For a moment, I saw him not as the man he'd become, but as the boy who once refused to share a toy truck, who cried until Mom scolded me instead. He had always been shielded, pampered, fed on her endless validation. Whereas I had been the soldier long before the uniform ever touched my skin. But now I realized they weren't just attacking me out of spite. There was strategy in this. A plan. I found Aunt Monica waiting near the stairwell, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her eyes brimmed with a sadness that made me ache. "They're lying, Nadine," she whispered. "This isn't about your service. It's about your father's estate." The words hit like shrapnel. "My father's estate?" She nodded quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "He left a portion tied up in legal trusts. Your name's on one of them. If they discredit you, if they prove you're unstable or unfit, that portion goes to Stephen instead." The hallway spun for a moment. My father, retired Navy captain, stern but fair, had died 5 years ago. He'd taught me how to stand straight, how to salute with pride, how to clean a weapon until it gleamed. He had also left us divided, his estate a silent battlefield waiting to erupt. I remembered his funeral. Stephen drunk on whiskey, slurring his eulogy. Mom weeping too loudly, as though performing grief for the neighbors. Only Aunt Monica had stood beside me as the flag folded, whispering, "He was proud of you, Nadine." Never doubt that. Now it all made sense. Mom's testimony wasn't about truth. It was about inheritance. About money. About power. The recess bell rang, echoing down the corridor. I straightened my uniform, smoothed my hair, and fixed my cap under my arm. My reflection in the glass doors looked like a stranger. Weary eyes, lips pressed into a thin line, metals gleaming under unforgiving light. I whispered to myself, steadying my breath. "You've faced worse. This is just another ambush, another enemy, another battle." When I stepped back into the courtroom, Mom avoided my gaze, but Stephen's smirk returned, confident, venomous. The Chief Justice raised his gavel. Court is back in session. As the air thickened and silence pressed in, I knew one thing. This wasn't just about defending my name. It was about fighting for my father's honor, for the truth he had trusted me to carry. And if my mother thought she could bury me alive in lies, she hadn't yet seen how a soldier fights when she's cornered. The gavel's echo hadn't even faded when my mother adjusted her pearl earrings, rose slowly, and asked permission to clarify her earlier testimony. Her voice was sugar-coated venom. "Your Honor, Nadine has always had difficulties. She masks them with her uniform, but the truth is, she can't manage responsibilities for long. I slammed my palms on the defense table. The crack startled the stenographer. "Enough," I said, voice shaking with fury, but steady with truth. The Chief Justice lifted an eyebrow, motioning for silence. "Major Whitaker, you will have your chance." My chance came with the introduction of evidence. My attorney, a fellow JAG officer, stood and slid forward a stack of deployment records, commendations, after-action reviews, each one stamped and sealed with the Department of Defense insignia. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said firmly, "Major Whitaker's service is not in dispute. 8 years of decorated service, multiple tours, countless lives defended. The only question here is why her own mother insists on fabricating incompetence." The prosecutor hesitated. The crowd stirred. My mother's smile faltered. But Stephen leaned in from behind her and whispered something. I caught only 2 words. The letter. My chest tightened. There it was, the weapon they thought would finish me. Back when I first returned from deployment, raw with nightmares, I had written my mother a letter. a desperate attempt to explain why I couldn't sleep, why I jumped at every car backfiring, why the shadows sometimes felt alive. I told her about the night patrol gone wrong, the IED that took Sergeant Henson's legs, the sound of him screaming while we dragged him to safety. I had written, "Sometimes I feel broken, Mom, like maybe I'll never be whole again." It wasn't weakness, it was honesty, vulnerability. But in her hands, I knew she'd twisted into a blade. Sure enough, she pulled a folded page from her handbag. My handwriting stared back at me like a ghost. Gasps echoed as she began to read, her tone syrupy and cruel. "Sometimes I feel broken. Like maybe I'll never be whole again." Does that sound like someone fit to serve, Your Honor? The words echoed through the chamber, ripping open wounds I had spent years stitching closed. I could almost hear Henson's screams, smell the metallic sting of blood in desert dust. My hands shook. But then, from the back row, Aunt Monica stood. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the chamber. That letter wasn't a confession of weakness. It was proof of her strength. She faced horrors none of you can imagine, and she survived. She chose honesty over silence, and you dare to weaponize it? The Chief Justice pounded his gavel for order. The room roared with murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously. My mother's face burned crimson, her composure cracking. I rose, taking a deep breath, every inch of my uniform stiff with resolve. Yes, I wrote those words. I wrote them after saving men who didn't walk away whole. I wrote them because carrying truth is what soldiers do. We don't hide, we don't run, we don't lie under oath. The justice studied me for a long moment. The silence was suffocating. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, voice calm but edged with steel. "This court will not allow grief twisted into slander. Proceed." My mother's hands trembled as she clutched the letter. Stephen's smirk vanished, but I knew this battle was far from over. Because if they had been willing to use my own words against me, what else were they hiding? And deep inside, a resolve hardened. If they wanted war, I would give them one. The courtroom lights felt hotter than any desert sun I had ever marched under. My pulse drummed in my ears as I stared at the woman who had birthed me, now trying to bury me. But wars are not won in silence. "Permission to present final testimony," my attorney said. The Chief Justice nodded. She slid forward a sealed folder stamped confidential. "This is the late Captain Whitaker's estate record and accompanying letter of instruction." Gasps swept the benches. The letter, in my father's stern handwriting, was read aloud by the clerk. His words carried through the chamber like a final order from beyond the grave. "To my eldest daughter, Major Nadine Whitaker, your discipline and honor reflect the highest traditions of service. It is my will that she inherit the trust bearing my name. She alone has carried my torch." My throat closed. The room blurred. My father's voice echoed in memory. Him teaching me to salute at age 10, his rough hand adjusting my elbow, whispering, "Pride isn't arrogance, Nadine. Pride is doing your duty when no one else will." Now, here he was, defending me even in death. My mother shot to her feet. "Forgery!" she shrieked, face twisted. "He would never leave her more than his son." The Chief Justice raised a single hand. "This record is notarized, authenticated, and filed by Naval Counsel. Sit down, Mrs. Whitaker." Her knees buckled as she collapsed back into her chair. Stephen muttered curses under his breath, but his jaw twitched with panic. The prosecutor, defeated, shuffled papers without a word. The justice struck his gavel. "This court recognizes Major Nadine Whitaker's service, integrity, and rightful claim. Testimony to the contrary is stricken. Case dismissed." The chamber erupted, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, voices colliding. My mother covered her face, pale and trembling. Stephen stormed out, fists clenched. Only Aunt Monica approached me, her touch warm on my sleeve, whispering, "Your father would be proud." But victory didn't taste sweet. It tasted like ashes. Because betrayal from strangers hardens you, but betrayal from family leaves scars you carry forever. I stepped outside the courthouse, the August heat wrapping me like a suffocating cloak. The press surged, microphones jabbing forward. "Major Whitaker, do you have a statement?" I looked past them, past the noise, to the flag fluttering above the courthouse steps. "Yes," I said quietly but firmly. "Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought in our own homes, and the wounds cut deepest when they're made by those we love. But today proves one thing: truth outlives lies." Later that night, I sat in my empty quarters on base. The silence pressed against me, but I let it in. My metals gleamed faintly in the dim lamplight. I traced the edges, remembering the men I'd served beside, the nights under fire, the mornings when survival felt like defiance. I thought of my mother's face, white with shock when the justice read my father Ila's letter. I thought of Stephen's bitter curses, and I realized I didn't need revenge. The truth had already done the work for me. Yet a part of me, the soldier part, whispered, "They drew first blood. They chose war. If they try again, I'll be ready." I stood, saluted my father's folded flag on the mantel, and let the words rise like a vow. Truth is stronger than blood.